The second branch of trait theory focuses on the psychological aspects of delinquency behavior, including the associations among intelligence, personality, learning, and delinquent behavior. This view has a long history, and psychologists, psychiatrists, and other mental health professionals have long played an active role in formulating this theory. And there are a number of different psychological views that have implications for the causation of criminal behavior. We're going to discuss the three most important psychological perspectives in criminal behavior: the psychodynamic theory, behavior theory, and cognitive theory. So let's begin with the psychodynamic theory. This places its emphasis on the notion that one of the main causes of criminality is people's abnormal personalities that were created and developed earlier in life. Since then, these quote-unquote unconscious mental processes have been controlling the person's criminal behavior. And Sigmund Freud originated this theory. He believed that we all carry with us the residue of the most significant emotional attachments of our childhood, which then guides us in our future interpersonal relationships. According to Freud, the human personality has a three-part structure: the id, the ego, the superego. The id is the primitive part of people's mental makeup, and this is present at birth and represents unconscious biological drives for food, sex, and other life-sustaining necessities. The id seeks instant gratification without concern for the rights of others. The ego develops early in life, when a child begins to learn that his or her wishes cannot be instantly gratified. The ego part of the personality that compensates for the demands of the id by helping the individual keep his or her actions within the boundaries of social convention. It's really the ego is primarily charged with reality testing. And it's not to be confused with the popular usage of the word like inflated ego or an egotistical person, but rather the ego is primarily concerned with how objectives might be best accomplished. It lays out the various paths of action that can lead to fulfillment. The superego develops as a result of incorporating within the personality the moral standards and values of parents and others. It is the moral aspect of or conscious of the personality, so it judges one's behavior. These three segments operate at the same time. They are balanced. If they are balanced, individuals lead normal lives. And if any of these are out of balance or more dominant than another, one can exhibit abnormal behavior. Because one had an unhappy experience in childhood or unhappy experiences in childhood, or had families that could not provide proper love and care, individuals suffer from a weak or damaged ego that make them unable to cope with conventional society. Weak egos are associated with immaturity, poor social skills, and excessive dependence on others. People with weak egos can easily be led into crime by antisocial peers and drug abuse. Some have underdeveloped superegos and consequently lack internalized representations of those criminal behaviors that are punished in society. So they commit crimes because they don't understand the consequences of their actions. One who's dominated by their id have a feeling of a loss of control, also known as psychotics. They may suffer hallucinations or inappropriate responses. There are many forms of psychosis, the common one being schizophrenia. The attachment theory and its link to criminality. This theory is concerning relationships between humans. The most important tenet is that young children need to develop a relationship with at least one primary caregiver for normal social and environmental development. This theory was formulated by psychiatrist and psychoanalyst John Bowlby. Within attachment theory, infant behavior associated with attachment is primarily the seeking of proximity to an attachment figure in stressful situations. Infants become attached to adults who are sensitive and responsive in social interactions with them, and who remain as consistent caregivers for some months during the period from about 6 months to 2 years of age. During the later part of this period, children begin to use attachment figures, those familiar people in their lives, as a secure base to explore from and return to. Parental responses lead to the development of patterns of attachment. These in turn lead to internal working models, which will guide the individual's feelings, thoughts, and expectations in later relationships. The failure of a child to develop attachments has been shown to cause them to develop various psychological disorders, including ADHD and similar disorders, as well as a failure to develop healthy relationships with others as they grow up. Researchers have linked detachment issues with crimes involving sexual assault and child abuse, and boys being more prone to suffer from detachment than girls. So attachment theory is forming an emotional bond to another person, and it is an important aspect to their mental health. The next perspective, the behavior theory. This maintains that human actions are developed through learning experiences, that people alter their behavior in accordance with the response it elicits from others. So in other words, behavior is supported by rewards and extinguished by negative reactions or punishments. For example, a child gets dessert after eating their entire dinner. What happens? They learn to eat successfully, right? If a child is punished for misbehaving, they learn not to do that behavior. This theory is also referred to as behavioral conditioning. And social learning is the most relevant branch of the behavior theory to criminologists. According to the social learning theory, people learn to engage in crime in the same way they learn to engage in conforming behavior, through association with or exposure to others. Primarily, the behavior modeling stems from three principal sources: family, environmental experiences, and the mass media. The imitation of criminal models behavior is not only a function of reinforcement and punishments one receives. That's like my example, as the child gets dessert after eating all of his or her dinner, but also of the behavior of those around them. In particular, individuals often imitate or model the behavior of others, especially when they like or respect these others and have reason to believe that imitating their behavior will result in reinforcement. So, for example, the boy who sees his father repeatedly hit his mother is likely to become a battering parent or a husband. The second source of behavioral problems, environmental experiences, suggest that individuals who reside in areas that are crime prone are more likely to display aggressive behavior than those who reside in low crime areas. One could argue that high crime areas are without norms, rules, and customs. Furthermore, there is no absence of conventional behavior. Manifestations of unconventional behavior include the inability to gain employment, drug or alcohol abuse, and failure to obey the local, state, and federal laws. Most important, individuals who adhere to conventional behavior are invested in society and committed to the goal or belief system. So they are involved in things like school and extracurricular activities, football, baseball, Girl Scouts, and they often have attachment to family. So there's two sides of the environmental experiences coin. And then our third source of behavioral problems are the mass media. But it is difficult to discern the ultimate role, though, that the media plays in regard to crime. Scholars have suggested that films, video games, and television shows, movies that depict violence are harmful to children. Ultimately, social learning theories beckon us to accept the fact that the mass media are responsible for a great deal of the violence in our society. They hypothesize that children who play violent video games and later inflict physical or psychological damage to someone at school did so because of the influence of the video game. Important to note that in the mentioned media outlets like video games, violence is often acceptable and even celebrated, right? That's what's going on? It's somebody runs down a police officer in a video game. It's, you get points. You're taking out pedestrians and so forth. If it's a driving game, Grand Theft Auto, I believe, is like that, right? Moreover, there's no consequences for the actions, right, of the major players. But here's an interesting example. What about professional athletes? Right? There's a lot of professional athletes that provide, examples of misbehavior without significant consequences. Over the last 50 years, there have been many documented cases of professional athletes who engaged in inappropriate behavior on and off the field. And these cases have important implications for the children who observe their behavior. So when, a 10-year-old amateur athlete imitates behavior that he has learned by observing professional sports figures, whom does society blame or punish with regards to that? Substantiating the relationship between media and violence is a fact that many studies suggest that media violence enables or allows aggressive children or adolescents to justify or rationalize their behavior. Furthermore, consistent media violence desensitizes children and adolescents. But a person could argue that viewing 10,000 homicides on television over a 10-year period prevents an individual from adjusting to the appropriate psychological response. So when but think about it this way, what happens when the local news reports about a homicide? Does the child or adolescent respond with sorrow or indifference? When searching for stimuli that foster violent acts, social learning theorists suggest that an individual is likely to inflict harm when he or she is subject to a violent assault, verbal heckling or insults, disparagement, and the ability to achieve his or her goals or aspirations. But not all criminologists are convinced that the violence media is linked. The violence on media is linked to violent behavior in children. Not all children who watch violence then turn around and engage in aggressive, violent behavior. Not all children do. So is it something else that's going on? Is it something else that's happening? Are those children being supervised as to what they're watching? Are they being socialized by parents and learning right from wrong? So when they watch violence on television or in the media, they have a different perspective? That's a tough one. The media and violence connection is a hotly contested item. And we're going to have that discussion as part of one of the assignments that you'll have to review, that you can choose to review. It's a choice option this week. Let's look at the other psychological perspective, the cognitive theory. Focuses on the mental processes by which criminals perceive and represent the world around them and how they solve problems. Cognitive is defined as an ability to process information. Cognition has to do with one's ability to learn information quickly, memorize, and understand information they receive. Cognitive theories of crime explain criminal behavior as a defect in moral thinking, thought processes, and mental development. Cognitive theories also help us to understand how an individual's personality and intelligence level are linked to crime. Violent individuals, for example, may see people as more aggressive or threatening than they actually are. Such a view may result in violence even at the slightest provocation. Research suggests that some people engage in violent attacks on others because they believe that they are actually defending themselves, even in the face of misperceived threat. Because of the way some people process information, they are unable to recognize the harm they are doing to other people. Individuals with inadequate cognitive processing perceive the world as stacked against them. They believe that they have little control over the negative events in their life. They cannot understand or sympathize with others' feelings and emotions, which lead them to blame the victim for the problems. One reason for this faulty reasoning is that they rely on a mental script. It's also referred to as a script theory. The mental script, generalized knowledge about specific types of situation that's stored in the mind. Generally, these types of scripts are developed in childhood that tells them how to interpret events, what to expect, how they should react, and what the outcome of the interaction should be. We all have this. People use ready-made scripts in everyday life to anticipate any appropriate sequence of events in a given context. We do it all the time. Here's an example. And think about your daily life as you go along interacting. But here's one. We know, you've been to a restaurant, we know when we arrive at a restaurant, there'll be a hostess that will check us in, see if there's a table available. We expect that the host or hostess will take us to our table, and that a server will soon arrive after we sit. They'll present us with a menu, take a drink order, and that's how it will proceed. They'll come back, they'll take our food order, we'll have our drinks, dinner will arrive, the paycheck will come. Most scripts play out per how we create them based on our experiences. But sometimes something unexpected might happen. You might get the wrong dinner order. The waiter might spill a drink on you, and you have to innovate. We learn this by experience. Here's an example putting into context this theory relative to crime. A young male child who is raised in a home where his mother was verbally and physically abused by his father. That boy is likely to have a skewed idea of what a healthy relationship is. He's more likely to be an abusive partner himself. His perception of women and relationships are likely to be negatively impacted and shaped by his upbringing. And the poor parenting model he received from the male figure of his household. All of those are going to play a role. Those are creating mental scripts in his head. And this was the script developed in his childhood to tell him how to interpret later events in his life. And that's how the cognitive theory works. So those are the psychological trait views. We are going to move on to the next topic at hand. Actually, before we move on to the next topic at hand, which is personality and crime and mental disorders and crime, here is a summary of the psychological theories broken out into a chart: the psychodynamic, the behavioral, and the cognitive that you can use for your studies.